There's a new phenomena that's been spreading across America. Most of us know about it, some of you don't. It's called living while black. Basically what it is, black people living their lives, going about their business, and then having police called on them by white people. Permit Patty, Barbecue Becky, it's happening all over the place, whether it's trying to cut grass for a living, trying to put up a lemonade stand, or just trying to play some basketball. I've come up with a solution, or a piece of a solution. I call it malicious summoning. And what it is statutory language, and it can be put in a criminal statute, it can be made a civil statute, or it can be a violation. And basically what it says is that any person who summons or calls a police officer on another person, regardless of a reasonable belief of necessity, with the intention of one, violating that person's either state or federal constitutional right, two, trying to harass or annoy that person, three, with the intention of subjecting that person to an unnecessary process, four, subjecting that person to unlawful discrimination, or that person's called law enforcement to somehow damage this person's standing within the community, financial prospects, consumer prospects. Before I go into showing you how this statute applies to these various situations, I wanted to give a little history lesson. This country was built on slavery. It's at the foundation of this country. It's at the root of capitalism that helped build this country. It's a fugitive slave clause that was actually included within the Constitution. And basically what it says is that if you're a slave, you remain a slave. Even if you leave from a slave territory into a free territory, that slave master was entitled to go and get you. And we had slave codes, we had laws. Believe it or not, white folks came up with laws to manage slaves. There was an educated slaves. Slaves had no rights they could enforce. Slaves couldn't sue anybody. They couldn't call the police on anybody. They were property. And these things were called slave codes. People challenged that, and helped slaves. And the Supreme Court said, no, our Constitution says you got to bring them back. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made some changes and amendments to the Slave Clause of 1787. And what it added is that now citizens were being required to help slave masters regain their property. No evidence was being able to be taken on behalf of a returned slave, and slaves had to be returned without process. That stayed in place until we had the Civil War. Everybody says it was over land, it was over resources, it was over slavery. So then we had Abraham Lincoln, and everybody remembers his great Emancipation Proclamation. He freed the slaves. Let's put a pin in that. And let me give you a civics lesson. Abraham Lincoln did not have the power to free the slaves. The best example I could give is, remember Obama with his DACA? What he was telling immigrants, he was saying, I'm the president, but I can't make you a citizen. Only Congress can make you a citizen. What Obama was saying is, I won't send you back if I find you, if you get reported. That's what Abraham Lincoln was saying. In his Emancipation Proclamation, he was basically saying, black people, slaves, if you make it up to the North, I won't send you back to the South. He was suspending the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That's what happened. So he didn't actually free slaves. He told them to come to the North, fight for our side, because if we win, then we'll be free. Because if the North lost the war, wow, we might still be slaves at this time. So as everybody knows, we won the war. And what followed soon after was the 13th Amendment, because it was Congress that had to free the slaves. So with the 13th Amendment, it says there's no more slavery. But if you read it closely, it says, unless you have been duly convicted of a crime. So what happened was, in the South, you started to see police forces across the antebellum South cropping up. At one time, these individuals were slave hunters, but now they're actually organized police forces. So as black people are leaving the farms and the plantations, walking around antebellum South, you know what they did? In response to the Emancipation Proclamation, they created these things called black codes. They were in Louisiana, they were in DC, they were in Maryland, and these were codes that basically criminalized the presence of newly freed black people. There were vagrancy laws that if they found black people who didn't have homes, didn't have jobs, didn't have employment or anywhere to be, they were arrested. Children in orphanages were taken and also put into these reform schools. And what they were put on chain gangs. And then, after being put on chain gangs, they were leased back to slave owners. Because you have to remember, this is after Civil War. The South is decimated. Crops were burned, houses were burned. So they needed to rebuild their economy. And the only way they knew how to do it is how they started it to begin with, which was free labor. And at this time, this free labor was still black people. So this continued for a couple of years until the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment gives equal protection under the law to anybody born here. Anybody born here is a citizen that's covered by the 14th Amendment. And when this occurred, this made the black codes go away because admittedly they were being used discriminatorily against newly freed black people. Ergo, these individuals weren't being treated equally under the law. And you know what happened? The South responded with Jim Crow. They said, look, we can't arrest you and put you in jail, but we can keep you from living with us, eating with us, prospering with us, educating your children with us. So no longer did this discrimination have the force of law. Now it was picked up by society. So at this time, you had people who you couldn't get a sandwich in a diner, you couldn't sit in waiting rooms, you could lose your job simply for being black. But then we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed by Johnson. And it had specific prohibitions against discriminating against black people in employment and housing and education and public accommodations. So it responded to Jim Crow. And as we know, it took many years and we're still dealing with it. The Civil Rights Act still addressing some of the remnants of not only Jim Crow, but slavery itself. The reason I give this history lesson is the old adage, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And what I believe is happening now, we're in the midst of a second Reconstruction. Just like somebody theorized that we're in the new Jim Crow, which represented the mass incarceration of black males across America, which represented the Black Lives Matter movement where black men and black women were being killed by police officers. We had Obama, first black president, and everybody believed that racism was over. There is no more discrimination. Black people have no more explanation why we can't pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. So as Obama left office and we have this new leadership in that wants to make America great, I believe the connotations of that intention are rooted in what I talk about in history. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1787, of 1850, Black codes, Jim Crow. It is in essence letting the white power structure know that you are entitled to live your life free of the presence of anyone who doesn't look like you. This living while black phenomena is revisiting this earlier political, socio-economic structure we had across this country. So I believe that we, as black people, brown people, I don't like saying minorities, but individuals who are having power exerted on them, we need something to empower us to push back, to kind of balance this social construct. And that's what I believe is my malicious summoning concept. What I want you to do is I want you to take this language, take this message, and I want you to get on Google, and I want you to find out who your state representative is. It's easy to find. And once you do, if you believe in the statute, if you believe in the language, send it to them. Ask them to sponsor this bill. Ask them to put it on paper, vote on it, and see if we can get it put on the books. I've given you something to do. Now go out and do something about it.